How are we doing, folks? Part 2 of our B25 rebuild now that I've got the frame straight. So now I've got the engine fully stripped. So I'm just looking at the crankshaft today. So I wouldn't normally take the weights off, but unfortunately I can't tell you how long I've spent trying to get the debris plug out absolutely solid. Tried with an impact, tried with the air wrench. In fact, I was hitting it so hard I was finding doing damage. So the easiest way is to take the weights off, and I don't know if I can catch this, but it's absolutely solid. Look at that, absolutely minging. So I've cleaned the crank. I've got to clean that out yet, obviously, but I've done the crank. I've blown it through from this end, blown it through from the pickup end all the way down to the cross drilling in the main bearing journal. I've also mic'd it up. I'm 2 thou down, so across the width where there's no load it's in size, but I'm 2 thou under top to bottom. I mean, to me, I'm still inside. I'm still quite happy with that 2 thou. So it's going to go back with new shells. So I ordered the new shells. There's the old, and there's the new, and these are from a reputable parts supplier in the UK. I'm not going to mention the name because I'm waiting for them to reply. But we've got oil holes in one pair, the originals, and not in the new ones. You only need one of the shells to have an oil hole in it, and it must obviously go in the top one. And it's quite important on a B25 because the conrod is drilled on an angle through to the middle of the journal, so this faces the left hand side of the bike, so it lubricates the loaded side of the bearing. So you've got a ball bearing on the non-driven side, but on the driven side you've got a roller bearing, and this is the feed, gives a little bit more extra oil into that roller bearing. So there's no way I can put these shells in. I may end up drilling one, but let's see what the supplier says first. So I'll just give him another few days, and if not I'll probably give up and try somewhere else. But a little bit disappointing. So the crank is recoverable with the new shells, the right shells obviously. Crank is now cleaned. I have given it a bit of a polish as well. I mean, the journals, obviously it's drop forged steel, but you've even really got to be very careful, even when you're miking them up, how easily this marks. So it's really soft. But yeah, not as good obviously as the old C15, not as good as the B50, but bit of a compromise I thought on the B25, going for a full circle crank or a one-piece crank as opposed to a composite crank on the C15 and the B50, because we could only now have shell bearings, which I'm not a great fan of. But when you think the last generation of C15s, the C15Gs, they were a fully roller bearing, ball bearing crank, so they were the end feed, so the oil feed comes in on the end of the crank, and because it was a composite crank, you had a steel or drop forged steel conrod, one piece conrod with a roller bearing, absolutely bulletproof. I mean, there's a massive difference between having the oil just being fed into a roller bearing, where you only need splash feed, so you don't need masses of oil going into the big end. But with steel backed white metal shells, you're now into hydrodynamic lubrication, so you need that oil pressure to fill the gap between the crank journal and the shells, and every time it fires it tries to push that oil away, but when the piston starts to come back up and you get the gap at the top, that oil is replenished. So a good oil pump and good quality clean oil is really important. And on the B25s, this is the weak point, so I'll be paying a lot of attention when I strip and clean the oil pump, and obviously the oil galleries, cleaning out obviously debris trap, the galleries in the crank, but also where we pick up the oil's obviously fed. The oil pump's mounted on the right hand crankcase, then through a gallery into the middle timing case, where it then feeds back via the relief valve and a one-way check valve down the centre of the crank. So there's an oil seal in that middle timing case, so that's got to be renewed. And I think on the very early ones, the Barracudas, the 67s, they didn't have a clip in there, a circlip holding the oil seal in place. So all that's really important, because we need this good oil feed, good oil pressure to cope with the weak point, which is the split shells, white metal steel back shells. So I'm going to build the crank now. Wait to see what happens when the shells, hopefully they'll come back to me and send me, I only need the one obviously with the oil feed hole in it, and the rest of it looks pretty good. It's the later type conrod, so they're a little bit more beefier in this area, a little bit more height here, because obviously that was a weak point. But really, if you've got good oil pressure, good oil, and the other downside is, which they only did on the B25s, the oil in frame versions, they actually fitted a return line oil filter, obviously to polish the oil, to keep the oil clean. So I will be fitting an oil filter in the return line of this engine. So I'm about to clean the rest of these up, build this up, and then we're going to jump onto the crankcase, installing the crankshaft into the crankcases. So we'll catch you in the next one.